ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, and I would imagine questions as they come along.
Absolutely. Just pipe up with anything.
Yeah, good. So, and this is a great one because it's something that actually has happened in my career way too long, you know. And how has the role of medical affairs team evolved?
Oh, geez. Yeah, it's a great question. It's almost easier to say how hasn't it
Yes.
evolved. So I joined industry in medical affairs just about a decade ago. And I think the pendulum swing in medical affairs had begun by then. And that was largely fueled, at least in the US, by issues around compliance, by issues around enforcement. But prior to that, medical affairs in almost every company sat within commercial and was very much seen as a support to commercial, even earning the not such a terrific title of white coat salesperson for many companies. And it's a real concern for the FDA, and it remains a perception that we need to be very attuned to. With that, and with the number of sort of enforcement issues, the pendulum very much swung the other way. There has been, for the past decade or so, a pretty significant firewall at every company, really, between medical and commercial. And that has led to its own issues internally of a sense that perhaps they shouldn't work together, which is clearly not true within the four walls of any company. But medical affairs, I think, has benefited a bit from getting to define more clearly what it can bring to the table, separate from what commercial brings to the table. And I think that role is beginning to settle out in a more constructive way. Medical affairs is really about being that bridge between R&D and commercial, R&D and the community, to be able to communicate around really complex science. And as we get into worlds of more treatments in rare disease, more subspecialty care, more truly specialized, personalized care, that becomes increasingly important. So medical affairs is evolving to do that job better. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, medical affairs was really MSLs. Now medical affairs is a much fuller career path that involves field but also in-house. And so there is more to do in medical affairs, I think, to be able to do that. One of the things we have to really be careful of, especially because medical affairs, MSLs in particular, were sort of born in that commercial organization, is remembering that as we think about medical affairs as a really separate function, that we have to lift that commercial lens off how we evaluate the contributions of medical affairs. I think in some companies, I still see a desire to put metrics, KPIs, that are akin to the ones that we put on the commercial field force. It's inappropriate in medical affairs. Medical affairs is now very much largely a reactive force. While there are certainly limited areas where proactivity is appropriate, it's a conversation I have often with colleagues when we decide how we want to deploy medical and just how much proactivity we want them to be responsible for,
Yes.
so it doesn't erode some of that scientific credibility.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I mean, you and your team have so much information, right? And generally, I mean, commercial folks, we're not clinicians. We don't have that type of background, and it only comes from talking to the customer. And you are that bridge to that, which, in my experience, has been probably underutilized.
Yes.
And it's a shame.
Yep.
It's a shame.
Well, and I think it's underrecognized. I mean, that's part
Yes,
of what
exactly.
medical affairs has to be able to do is communicate what's the value of med affairs if it's not in sales, if it's not in supporting prescriptions.
Yep. So one thing, right, medical affairs has always been very involved with is thought leadership, identification,
Right.
understanding, and building. So could you talk a little bit about that and some of the evolution beyond that too?
Yeah, absolutely. So thought leader relationships, I think, are still really a core piece of what medical affairs
Absolutely.
does, a core role for MSLs. That said, thought leader visits are not, they're not like the tickets you win at Chuck E. Cheese with your kids. They're not good for anything on their own. So seeing a thought leader every month, if the documentation in your CRM is talk to Dr. Smith said she was fine, I said, great, see you next month, that's kind of not of great value to anybody. So I believe in really maximizing those thought leader relationships, ensuring that our MSLs have the scientific background and understanding that they are having really impactful discussions. If they're only gonna see Dr. Smith 3 times a year, I'm okay with that. If the feedback I'm getting in the CRM is, hey, Dr. Smith told us that this patient advocacy group is gonna lobby to revamp the treatment guidelines in 6 months, and they're gonna try to involve these 6 people in the community. Well, that's amazing information. That's worth a visit.
Absolutely.
And so maximizing that, being sure that our MSLs are really the stewards of those relationships, being sure that we tie in as an organization all of the visits to the thought leaders. So our friends in ClinDev, when they pick up the phone and call somebody, we know about that, and the MSL doesn't walk in blind. When an executive wants to go out and do a field ride, that we loop that in so that we function as a single organization with clear stewardship of that relationship. And that's a bi-directional relationship, that they're not data dump visits, that they are in fact value add visits both ways. So that's a huge piece. But I also think Med Affairs can do an enormous amount, and this is part of the reinvention piece, outside of thought leader relationships. So in the external sphere, there are a lot of places that medical affairs is reaching and can reach and should reach. So when we think, for example, about patient advocacy and engagement, I think there's a big role for medical affairs there. When we think about external communications, whether you call that public relations or communications in your company, medical affairs can be very impactful. You've got medical professionals in these seats. They are people that can conduct interviews. They can talk to the media if they're media trained. They have that scientific background to be able to have those interactions in a really impactful way. They can talk to patient advocacy groups. We can also talk on the business side of the house when we go talk to payers. So the FDA has now said it's okay to go in ahead of approval and have conversations. Payers want to understand what's the budget impact of this wonderful new medicine that you're saying you're going to bring to market that's so innovative. Well, guess who can talk to that value story? Guess who can talk to about the disease state and the unmet medical need? That's medical. That's what medical can do. Certainly once you're post-approval, medical is exactly the right function to be bringing in to further explain to payers where this medicine might sit in a treatment paradigm, especially if it's disruptive. Evidence generation. I think evidence generation is an enormous place that medical affairs should have impact. I'm a firm believer in medical affairs being involved back to phase 2, because that's when we start looking at endpoints for our phase 3 trials. Certainly medical affairs should be part of 3B4 and life cycle management, but just curious, has anybody on the commercial side of the house ever sat through a top-line results presentation for a trial and looked at each other and said, what am I supposed to do with that data? How am I supposed to talk about that endpoint? That ever happened? And it's just happened once or twice to me, where I've sat at that table and my commercial colleagues have looked at me and said, and now what? You need to have medical affairs in those conversations, not just talking about the data gaps, which we certainly should do, but so that when in clinical development, if you go in and you say, my prescribers want to know about quality of life. That's the endpoint they want to know about. And you come out 3 years later with data that was generated using an obscure patient-reported outcomes subscale. And that's what you're supposed to be using for claims now. And you all sit around the table and go, I can't, that's not going to help. The way you get around that is you have people who are in touch with the voice of the customer sitting in those at those conversations. So when clinical development says, oh, I know how I can measure this. It's this patient-related outcome. You've got somebody in your corner saying, no, that's not it. We need to do something that's closer to the clinician, because that's what medical affairs brings.
So you don't suggest waiting for launch and then doing a phase 4 trial and 4 or 5 years later getting the indication?
Yeah. No, I don't suggest that at all.
Okay, good,
No.
good. It's kind of interesting with the KPIs and the traditional sales forces and reach and frequency
Yep.
and so much that less is more, right? And it's a different conversation. So
Yep.
I think that's a powerful point you
Yeah,
made.
yeah,
Um, when you build a team, what types of things? What are the type of people, the skill sets, the philosophy
Yep.
of the individuals to help build a strong team?
Okay, so I should just preface this for everyone by saying that I'm from Boston, and then what I say next will make more sense to you. But the first thing that I look for when I'm building a medical affairs team is everybody has to be wicked smart. Do I need to translate that? So
I think you have enough,
some people might have said deep scientific expertise, but that's not what I mean. I really do mean that you need to hire smart people. You need to hire scientifically smart people, because if they are scientifically smart, they will learn your product. They will learn your therapeutic area. Would it be ideal to have everybody on the team have deep therapeutic knowledge? Maybe, although I am a big fan of diverse backgrounds because I think it does bring things to the team. And I sit, and I talk about CF and somebody says, oh, well, but when I worked in MS, it was this. So I do think it's useful to have different backgrounds. I'm not sure everybody really needs to be from your therapeutic area to work on that medicine. If you hire smart people, they will learn, right? This is medical affairs. Everybody has a terminal D degree. You're not hiring dummies. They've already shown that they can be intelligent and learn lots of different areas in their training. They will do it again for you. So that's the first thing. They've got to be smart. One of the other things that I look at, and I am a firm believer in this, especially in regional and country level medical affairs, you've got to hire people who understand the local medical practice. Maybe not so much on the MSL side, because that's their day job. They're going into offices. If they don't already know it, they're going to figure it out pretty fast. But when you hire your in-house people who are coming up with your medical strategy and tactics, who are developing your medical materials, if they don't understand how your clinicians practice, what the patient journey is, what the day looks like, they are not going to do a good job in making what you need. A very recent example, I saw an ad in one of my medical journals in the last few weeks from the AMA that said that US physicians today, on average, fill out 24 pre-authorization forms a day. Well, if you work in an area where you need a PA, guess what you're going to be up against? You're going to be up against very tired, cynical physicians who, no matter how good your medicine is, they're going to look at it and roll their eyes and think, oh my goodness, not another one. So if your people don't know how an office is set up in the US and what the limited resource is to fill out a PA and what it takes to fill out a PA, and the fact that that's not one form, that is as many forms as insurers you take, right? Because every PA is different. Then how are your people going to be able to train the MSLs to address that? So you really do need a good understanding of local medical practice. I think the third thing you need to do is hire strategic thinkers, because if you want medical affairs to sit at the table and be something other than a support function, if you want medical affairs to be a true business partner, you've got to have strategic thinkers. So you have to have people who understand the treatment of your disease today, not just your medicine, but the overarching treatment, because I can't actually think of any chronic illness that requires one medicine. So you need to understand all of it. You need to understand where the research is, who's developing what, and you need to understand the evolution of the payer space, because how a medicine is paid for makes a big difference in how it's accepted. And that is in constant evolution in every area of the world that I'm aware of. So you need some of them at the table too. And then I guess the last one, which is maybe the most foundational and absolutely non-negotiable in my book, is you've got to hire people with great interpersonal skills. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what job you're taking in Med Affairs. Your job is essentially relationship management, whether that's external relationship management or a combination of internal and external stakeholders. That is what medical affairs does. And so there's no pass on that. You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you can't manage significant numbers of interpersonal relationships, if you can't flex your style, if you can't adapt, then I don't think you can work in medical affairs.
And Deborah, you touched on this a little bit beforehand, but maybe you could elaborate. When should a medical affairs team be built during the development process for a drug?
Ah, such a great question.
Early.
As early as possible. So, I'll give the best answer, which is right, it depends. It depends a little bit on your company around where you currently are and where you have strengths. So if you're a company that does asthma and you're bringing another asthma medicine in, you probably just need to build up your brand team. You probably already got a lot of the things in place.
Good point.
But if you're going into a new therapeutic area or you're a startup and this is the beginning, I really don't think you can start too early. You need to do life cycle management. You need to do 3 before work. As you said before, you don't want to be starting 3 before work at launch. You won't have anything new to say for 5 years. So that's a mistake. So that, sort of global or business unit level role in med affairs, I think you need at least 3 years out.
Yeah.
Further, if you have a slow evidence generation kind of process in your company. At the local, regional level, depending on what region you're talking about, at least 2 years. If you're launching in the US and it's your major market, that's an absolute minimum. Because you need them to build out your launch plans, decide on your tactics. You need to build out your thought leader network, figure out who they are. And then sometime between 2 years and about a year out, you need to build out the rest of your team, including your field team. But always remember, when you're thinking about medical, that you are talking about hiring very skilled, highly trained people. It's a really small pool of people.
Yes.
And they're onboarding. If you're hiring clinicians in the US, they have a minimum of 3 months notice they have to give their clinical jobs, longer if you're outside the US in some cases. Onboarding for medical is 3 months minimum for the field in terms of training. And those recruitment timelines can be a bear. 6 months to a year is not all that unusual. So, definitely put all that stuff in your Gantt chart with your deliverable date and do a pretty significant backtracking on those because hiring and upskilling a medical team takes quite a while.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
What recommendations do you have for people who work in other departments, the marketing departments, to better collaborate with the medical affairs?
Okay, that's a good question.
Great question. So collaborating with medical affairs. It should be pretty natural. So a few things that I have done on the medical side, especially with marketing colleagues, I am a big believer in sort of concept discussions. So I have always held office hours. So even before you go to an agency and get stuff mocked up, so that marketing has the ability to come and say, hey, pie in the sky, this is what we'd like to do. Based on the data we've got, what could that look like? Does this make sense? Any caveats you can think about? What language might work well for physicians? What language might not work well? If I'm looking at DTC, what do you think of this? It helps a lot. It saves a lot of money on the agency side, I think, if you're able to have those discussions before you even come through. I know sometimes other functions like regulatory or legal will often say, well, show us what that would look like and we'll react to it. I don't think that's necessary with medical because we're starting in the data. And so we can have conversations with our colleagues about what does this data mean and how do we think you might need to show it to keep true to it, to what the data is really saying. So the other thing I would say is if you're in a company where for some reason the medical organizational structure doesn't fairly closely mirror the commercial structure, that's a conversation to have. Because those really ought to be very close relationships. My experience has been that it makes sense to make sure that those match up organizationally pretty closely. Yeah. Any questions? Nobody wants to know how medical's going to use digital? I do. I don't know. I think it's an important ongoing conversation, and one that we have to keep having with our marketing colleagues, because again, those are places where we shouldn't be coming out of left field from a medical standpoint, but clearly physicians and other prescribers live in the digital world too, just like everybody else. We're definitely seeing more desire to have conversations different ways. A lot of times people would like to interact by email with less face-to-face time. You know how busy physicians are in offices. And so I think it is incumbent on medical to figure out how our prescribers and our medical customers want to interact digitally and find ways to do that in a compliant way. But if your medical affairs departments aren't thinking about that, they should be.
Yeah, good point.